I believe the broadcast is live, young Mr. Carroll.
Here we are. And welcome to this conversation with Mr. Fry and TC here. Where are you, Stephen?
Well, I'm in Los Angeles, actually, Southern California, which is not a wise place to be in terms of infection. But given that I'm secluding myself and not seeing anybody, you can do that anywhere, really. So one might as well be here. And I have things that brought me here to do in studios that are very kind of COVID friendly. So I'm getting on with mostly audiobooks, to be honest, just recording for the Audible company, audible.com. Whole series of
So have you read any good books lately?
I have. I read them out loud with my lips moving and everything. The two great Orwells, 1984 and Animal Farm, and you may think, of course, Amazon, who owns Audible, is one of those impoverished companies that needs to wait for an author's copyright to expire before they bother to do new versions of him, because that's what's happened. You've probably noticed as well, The Great Gatsby, there's been a lot of talk about that's gone into public copyright, and so they're talking about, will there be a Muppet Great Gatsby? And of course, the more intelligent people are saying, will there be a Shaw Theatre Great Gatsby? They no longer have to pay the Fitzgerald estate. Now, are wheels revolving in your mind now?
They are, but tell me how this applies to George Orwell, who did, of course, as you are about to tell us, die in 1949.
Yeah, that's true, actually. That's later than the others. So should he still be in copyright? Perhaps I made a mistake. Perhaps he's not.
No, he should have left it, because 70 years is the copyright. So 2019, Orwell came out of copyright.
Oh, so he's been out of there for a few years, a couple of years. You're right. Yeah.
And people may not know, but in Canada, we have only a 50-year statute of limitations.
Oh,
so Orwell's been out for 20 years here.
That's really strange, because Canada shares with Britain the same territorial nature, doesn't it? So that a book that's published in London, say, is also in Canada. I mean, I know this from my own books, whereas you have to have separate publication in America because it's considered a different territory. But obviously Canada is its own territory when it comes to copyright expiry. We can't be talking about expirations of copyright all the time, though it is an interesting subject, because there is a kind of ethical question to it, isn't there, as to how much the descendants of a dead artist deserve to constantly to take in all this money. And probably most agents and producers and will agree that when dealing with an estate, it is quite common for the children and grandchildren of the great woman or great man to be a bit difficult, shall we say. The keepers of the sacred flame on the one hand, who are the ones who burn the private letters and refuse to let anybody quote a single line, possibly, or who are just so greedy that they consistently charge vast sums for
well, of course, and then there's Bernard Shaw himself, who, as you know, did rather interesting things with his estate.
Did indeed. But at the time of the making of My Fair Lady, it was the most expensive movie ever made. And the reason for that was not so much the budget, although that was very big, as the huge payment to the Shaw estate that Jack Warner made for the rights of Pygmalion, I believe.
Yes, indeed. And Shaw, as well as endowing the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, also left a large amount of money for the establishment of a rational spelling system.
Yes, that's right.
Which didn't really take off, as we can see. So.
No, indeed, and his name is still spelt slightly differently from the adjective for certain.
Indeed, and pronounced differently here. So I sometimes, when I first arrived in Canada, I would make puns like we could go for a walk along the shore, thinking that was a terrifically elegant pun, but they all fell flat because they say, what do you mean?
What's the similarity between shore and shah?
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's the same with rhyming in lyrics and poetry, that a British lyricist, a Tim Rice or a Don Black, can rhyme, if they wanted to, porn, as in pornography, with lawn, as in where you walk on the grass. But in America, again, that would make no sense in either country of North America, Canada, or porn and pawn are different things. You push a pawn in the game of chess, but it's nothing to do with porno.
No, it's much more rational, in fact. Now, I wanted to ask you today to talk a little bit about storytelling.
Yeah.
Because that's something that you're very good at, and it's something that you did for us. So I was going to start by asking you how you look back on your time at the shore. Was it a fun summer?
Do you know, Tim, it really was. It was one of the most wonderful summers I've ever spent, both in terms of the late spring a rehearsal period, which I never really told you how nervous about it I was. I mean, for months beforehand, I thought I should have been better prepared than I was. I thought I should know every line of Homer and every line of Greek myth, and that I should come with absolute preparation. But instead, there was this remarkable experience of walking from the little house I rented and watching a spring like no other. I mean, in terms of blossom, Niagara-on-the-Lake has it on every other town I've ever visited at springtime. I mean, it's just stunning how it bursts into life. So there was a marvelous sense of a long winter having come to an end. When I arrived, there was still snow on the lawns, and then this magnificent change of climate. And I was discovering this new town in a new place I'd never visited. And I had all the time in my head that it was supposed to be very simple, that I sit in a chair and share a story. But I was worried that it would look lazy. Surely I should be leaping about and transforming myself in weird ways and becoming gods and really doing a performance. But what I wanted to do was to bring it down and I had this image, as you know, I think, in my head, which was of a family sitting around a fire and of children saying, why does water come from the sky? Why? Who does it? Who sends it? Because all our ancestors would have said who, not what, really. When there's a force, a movement that you don't understand, you think, who is it? Well, who is making the noise in the mountain when it rumbles, which is now we would say, that's old news. It's a volcano, or that's an earthquake, or, why is something pushing flowers out of trees every, time? Is it how long it is? It's what we call a year. Out come these flowers from the trees. Who sends them? What is this movement, this motion that we don't control, but somebody else does? And that's what we call a god. Whether it's the force that pushes flowers out of trees or the force that drops the leaves 6 months later in autumn, or whether it is the weather or the movement of the sea, or indeed other movements that we don't control, like our rage and our fear and our love and our lust. All of these, until you find a theory to describe their agency properly in terms of physical laws, all these things you give a name and an identity and a character. And those characters are gods, the god of love and the god of seasons and the god of thunder and the god of earthquakes, the god of harvests and all these things, and of fire. And over those periods of sitting around the hearth telling your children this, they become more detailed and they had more personality and they take on more kind of resolution. They're more HD, they're more filled with life and color and depth and surprise. So they become almost literary creations because, rather than just being stereotypes of angry God, they become a God that's, ambiguous and contradictory and doesn't behave as you would expect. And so early myth and explanation of the forces around becomes a complex theatre and an art form, a literary effusion of characters. And all the time, each generation of children are sitting around going, now I know more about Hermes. So tell me that time Hermes did this, or tell me about the time that Zeus was nearly killed by his own daughters, or tell me about how the giants took over, and it becomes a whole fantastic panoply of stories that stay with you. And they have these different phases, the early phase of explaining how things are into a more complicated phase of addressing almost every aspect of humanity, everything about ourselves that we find puzzling, our own lust, and yet our yearning for purity, our yearning for love and for holiness and for goodness, our yearning to be thought of well and as having behaved well, our yearning to achieve and to fulfill what we think our potentials are. All these things combine with our fear of the dark things inside us, these thrashing, slimy qualities of frenzy and addiction and revenge and darkness that we all have. And this mixture, well, there are different ways of explaining it. And one of the reasons you and I love theatre, love literature, is that the way literature and theatre explain it is dramatized. It's brought to life in front of us. It plays out the story of our contradictions. Other explanations, neurological, psychological, Freud, say, or common theories of how our minds are composed by our genes and by our upbringing and so on. All these are interesting, and I wouldn't for a moment say that they're wrong, because they're an obvious way to look at why we are the way we are, this composition of animal and of what seems to be something higher in the cognitive sphere. But none of them, I think, plays with this truth as well as mythology and everything that springs from mythology. So it's the root of storytelling, and it's the root of theatre, and it's the root of making a ritual and a ceremony and a celebration and a comedy and a tragedy out of all the pieces that make us human, I suppose.
That's beautiful. And it's quite a long way, isn't it, from explaining why it rains to some of those myths that you were telling in Mythos, which are even still 3,000 years older than we are now. So how did that happen? I mean, myths, you used the word, I think, evolve, or at least you didn't. That was the gist, wasn't it? And there's something fascinating to me about, if myths are reproduced as we are by being handed on from one person to the next, there must be something about these particular myths that allowed them to survive while others dropped away.
There is, and it's a difficult one, because paleontologists and archaeologists and ancient historians will obviously have different views. And as we know, the truth of science and investigation and archive and hard academic work always wags a finger at the facile, kind of cheap explanation that sounds so good in a quick conversation. Those are, but really, so that there are the popular scientists and explainers, the Malcolm Gladwells and the Noel Yuval Hararis, who tell fabulous stories that seem to shed light on how we develop. But behind them are always piles of academics who go, "Oh, it isn't quite as simple as that." But nonetheless, I think it is fair to say that it's probably wrong to cede too much exceptionalism to the Greeks. They happen to be in the right place at the right time. That it would be a weird kind of, I suppose we call it racism today, to suggest that the tribes that congealed around the mainland and islands of Greece, the Dorians and the Ionians and the various different peoples who arrived from the sea and who settled and became what we think of as Greek, that they were endowed with some form of intelligence or creative spark that was greater than any other human beings around at the time. I think what happened was, and I don't know enough about this to go into massive detail, but there was the Bronze Age, We name our ages after metals, at least out of materials, I should say. There was the Stone Age, when the most that human beings could do in terms of repurposing the materials around them into which we were born was stone, using stone on stone to make flint arrows and all the rest of it. We know about that. That's the Stone Age, and there was a new Stone Age, a Neolithic age. But then some of our ancestors discovered that you could do things with copper and tin, which made decorative and useful and aggressive objects out of this molten stuff, this alloy that we call bronze. And that was the Bronze Age. And it was during the Bronze Age, it seems, that certain Mediterranean tribes settled enough to create an empire, the Mycenaean Empire, and a language, a written language, rather, all humans were speaking by this time, but they created an alphabet, well, not an alphabet, it's a syllabary. It's called Linear A, and it's never been solved. And that's the era of Agamemnon and the Mycenaean Empire, and supposedly the Trojan War. So there was a bit of writing, but we don't know who could do it, whether it was a hierarchical group of priests and kings. And anyway, the Trojan War was fought, and then there was a huge collapse of this civilization, a bit like I suppose, the fall of the Roman Empire, where it gave way to a Dark Ages. Similarly, archaeologists call it what followed the Greek Dark Ages, the collapse of the Bronze Age. No one quite knows why it happened. There were some people who maybe invaded, these so-called sea people. And anyway, there was a huge amount of trouble. And then they grew back again. But in between that time, they had transmitted their stories of their wars and their fights and their actual events, including a war that took place in what we call Turkey now, and we call the Trojan War. And writing came back, but this time in Crete in a form Linear B that was solved in the 20th century, and all around the Mediterranean, thanks to the Phoenicians from the Holy Land, from sort of Lebanon area, just south of Lebanon. What we now call the alphabet arrived. And so they were finally able to write down the stories that had just been told mano a mano, orally. They were able to write them down, and it became a literature. And the Greeks were the only people in a position to do that. They were just at the center of that Mediterranean crossroads of trade and the exchange of ideas from the Phoenicians. And the other thing which we should think about, I guess, as we approach an opposite age, is that the sea levels appear to have sorted themselves out. They appear to have lowered. And for hundreds of years, if not thousands before then, people had lived on the edges of continents where there was sea in order to sail, but they couldn't build ports and harbors because they didn't know from one year to the next when the sea level would be right for that. So they'd build a harbor, and then the next year it would just get completely swamped by high tides. But suddenly everything they noticed settled down, and they thought, oh, 4 years in a row now, this particular bay has been exactly the same shape. And they started to build a few kind of moles and groins and other such things. I say that word with all due respect. And so you could start to get commercialization and the transmission of ideas and goods that only trade allows. No matter how anti-capitalist one is, one has to accept that capitalism is the main vector for ideas as well as for money and goods and produce and all the rest of it. And the ideas spread like wildfire once you had these settled coastal towns. So Tyre in the Phoenician area was an important one for Tyrian purple and for other high-priced goods. And the Tyrians, who were the Phoenicians, also took with them this new way of representing sounds by letters, as we would call them now. So it's a complicated answer. I'm not really qualified to give it exactly. But the reason the Greek myths are so exciting, I think, is because the Greeks happened to be at that point of time where everything was growing, the trade and commerce and ideas could be written down, and and the memories of poets who had just spoken these things could be recorded finally in a way that kept.
That's lovely. It's a good opportunity to mention that quite soon, not this year, but we are very hopeful next year, we'll be staging the Mahabharata, which is
So good.
which is a marvelous.
You're too young, in fact, to remember Peter Brook's Mahabharata, aren't you? Or did you see it?
No,
Did you see it?
I skived off from my final year at Oxford to go up to Glasgow and see it.
Well, those watching who are lovers of theatre will probably have heard of Peter Brook, who's one of the most influential figures in theatre and drama generally, and art of the late 20th century. And you can probably tell more about him than I can, but he famously stripped drama down at a time in the 60s when new writing was coming in. He also went back to ancient writing. Shakespeare, famously, his production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Everybody who saw that, which I didn't, says it was their greatest evening ever in the theatre. And it's The Midsummer Night's Dream, really the most popular, easy, cheesy Shakespeare imaginable. And he made it something utterly new. And then he started traveling around the world, didn't he? He went to Africa, and he went then to India and discovered the tradition of this Mahabharata, this extraordinary epic work, which you have obviously been involved in. Have you been working on the translation with others?
No, our great friend Ravi Jain is adapting with Miriam Fernandez and going to direct it. And I'm really thinking of it as, I mean, it's a great thing that we're doing it, but I'm also thinking that it's living proof that the answer to what's so special about the Greek myths is obviously, well, nothing necessarily. There's no reason to suppose that every developed culture, and of course the culture that gave rise to the Mahabharata was an extraordinarily rich one. And the interesting thing for me, though, in terms of evolution, is that whether it's an amazing epic like the Mahabharata, whether it's a set of myths as fascinating as the Greek myths, in themselves, they must have gone through evolution just to get to the versions that we find them in.
Yeah.
You know, and you will have read Bruno Bettelheim's wonderful book, The Uses of Enchantment, where he talks about folk tales and fairy tales as being handed down from parent to child, and that must go through this process of winnowing, where all the details that don't achieve what the story could achieve drop away naturally.
Yeah.
Beautiful little details that do what it is trying to do.
Giving a Darwinian kind of twist to the nature of story as it evolves through the generations. Also
rise to the question of what it is that it's doing.
And also, of course, there's the nature of what one calls a civilization. And obviously we're hypersensitive to this idea now that we all know the famous Gandhi answer to when he was asked what he thought about Western civilization, and he said, "I would welcome it." And of course we love to beat ourselves up and say, yes, I know what you mean. And this idea that there is an advanced form of humanity and that white Westerners are the vanguards of that is now obviously regarded rightly as not just nonsense, but pernicious nonsense and self-deceptive and also a kind of part of what fueled some of the most questionable forms of colonialism and so on. But having said that, it is also obviously true, in a non-judgmental way, without having to use words like primitive and savage, there are peoples who survive in ways that involve very elemental ideas of food, weather, the seasons, and so on. And they exist in smaller groupings, and their whole lives are based around those issues of seasons and the sea, so for example, First Nation groups in Canada, those into the north of the Arctic Circle, their lives are dominated by the huge changes of light and cold that take place in these big seasons, and in being able to when the sea is not frozen, being able to go out and so on. But there are other groups who were like that to begin with, but over 4,000 or 5,000 years, such as happened with the Greeks, who were more or less settled, who went from a position of what we would now call tribalism and a quite simple hunting, but not hunter-gatherer, slowly laying down crops and becoming civilized, into building cities and towns, into having hierarchies and castes of priests and of priestesses, and into more complex forms of living than those who lived according to the hunt and the season. And their myths, therefore, took on more complexity as well, that their gods became like them, more, they became darker, more devious, more subtle, more filled with, and then responsible for different handcrafts and skills that had not existed hundreds of years earlier. So in that sense, that's how things grow and develop, isn't it? I think so.
It's worth anyone who's interested in these things. Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, actually shows the similarities between almost all the mythic structures of the world, and how, in a funny sort of way, however sophisticated one's life might be now, we seem to want the same things from stories that we wanted thousands of years ago, which brings me to my last question before I'll start taking questions from the audience, some of whom are writing in already and asking things, which was, you were sitting in front of an audience in 2018 or whatever it was, and telling these very, very old stories. And how did you feel that landed? Did you get a sense of, oh, I'm just telling people old stories and they're bored? Or
no,
wasn't the feedback we got?
I think it was really encouraging. In as much as one can trust it, and I think one can, you actors always know when an audience is holding on, listening and engaged, and when they're, and then when they're, because we're all vain and we all want to be listened to, and so we're constantly looking for cues, like children, that mummy is listening and daddy is listening, and I've got my audience and they're paying attention. I had been worried that a lot of people from Canada, which is actually a country that seems to me to be more aware of the difficulties of its position in terms of the First Nation and the colonial input from the British and the French, and then the later waves of immigration and so on, that it's working these things out more. So, for example, before the show, this is not something that happens in Britain, but the talking about who this land used to belong to, and thanking the First Nation people for having been guardians of the land and so on. And all this was new to me. And so I immediately thought, when I was told this was part of the Canadian experience now, is to try and engage with everything dark and unhappy, as well as more optimistic and successful, all the elements of life in Canada. I had thought that maybe people would say, why are you coming here with Greek myths? The First Nations have their stories, their creation stories, their stories of the moon and the stars they came from, and that's more relevant to us. And I didn't want, I wanted it to be quite clear that I wasn't making a case for an old Victorian educational system, and we should all learn the classics, and if we can't tell stories about Hermes and Aphrodite, then we are, we're not educated, because that wasn't the point at all. The point was to try and just make people lean forward and go, wow, I've heard of some of these names, but I didn't really know that was. So that's how Zeus was born. I've heard of Zeus. I didn't know. Goodness me, and to make the connections. I didn't want to force any meaning onto it. I didn't want to say this myth means, because I think the excitement is to hear a myth yourself and go, oh, in a way, that's just the Greeks, trying to work out why incest is so problematic or something, or, oh, that's the Greeks. In more obvious cases, looking at let's face it, we've all been thinking of how Greek myth and Freud and human psychological problems, shall we say, narcissism. I mean, it's obvious when I was doing the show in 2018, and I told the story of Narcissus, which is a beautiful origin story and a puzzling one and one that most people know. This boy who sees his own reflection in the water and falls in love with it and doesn't realize it's his reflection, thinks it's someone in the water. And of course, as Oscar Wilde pointed out, it's also the reflection in the water, seeing someone up there and seeing them reflected in their eyes, seeing themselves reflected in the eyes of the person looking in. But anyway, all that, I would naturally end it with narcissism now is looked at not as a story for artists to paint daffodils, but as a psychological dysfunction, malignant narcissism, people who can't take criticism, who believe the world revolves around them, who sees everything according to their own ambition and their own sense of self. And, I didn't make this big description of what was a malignant narcissist and lean forward and say, nobody we know. And the audience would scream with laughter because, of course, everybody, the elephant in the room was the trumpelo in the room. Everybody would immediately say, ha ha, we know what you're talking about. But the fact is, this will have been true if you went back 1,000 years, if you went back to a court of Norman kings, say, in Britain, and started to speak about narcissism. They'd all nudge each other and go, so he's talking about William II. The fact is that there are such truths in mythology, such absolute truths about human nature, and we get overexcited perhaps by so many other aspects of the Greek myths or of stories generally, of plays and dramas, that we forget that what they really are is stories about ourselves. They're just wonderfully about ourselves. They are mirrors. It's such a cliche, we forgot to say it, that Hamlet's and the players, to hold a mirror, as it were, up to nature, it's a very important part. And let's face it, this coronavirus pandemic, again, this can sound so pretentious, but I would suggest that a lot of health and happiness has been maintained amongst millions of people by their ability to tune in to television drama, actual theatrical drama, opera, dance, music, all kinds of performance art, poetry. These things have kept people sane over the past year. And let's face it, we don't owe economists and politicians the same thanks for keeping our souls more or less happy or content or connected, if you like. Because we talk about the technological connection. I mean, the statistics about this this past year are terrifying. Do you know that if the richest people in America, if the 40 richest people in America gave every American $3,000, every American $3,000, they would still be richer than they were 9 months ago. Wow. That's how much money billionaires have made during this period. And now we can be class angry about that. We can be anti-capitalist about that. And we can do all kinds of things about that. But I think it's worth just remembering that if we've been kept sane, if we've been kept amused, if we've been kept in touch with our fellow humans over the past year, it's because of the performing arts, more than anything else. And in some cases, the performing arts have been purely commercial, Netflix and all the rest of it. It's a transactional thing. You pay this money, you get this. You get Bridgerton, or you get whatever, Tiger King, or whatever happens to be the thing, and we can say that's silly or whatever. But it is, these things come out of theatrical training and a belief in pursuing what it is that we are, our fellows. These people whose arms, we can't put our arms around them for real. But we are fully aware of our position as human beings and the mystery of being alive, and we owe everything to artists for helping us think about that during this past year. Anyway, I don't want to overdo that thing, but it is true, surely, isn't it?
I think so, and it's important to say that it's only been a palliative, really, hasn't it? Because the real thing is still being in the same room with the art and the performance. And, much as I'm sure anyone would enjoy a film of your performance as Mythos, it would not be the same thing as being in the room, all breathing together and leaning forward, and, not just having the high wire aspect of it, of, will he lose his place or whatever, but forgetting all of that high wire stuff, which you do when it's going really well, and simply leaning forward to hear what comes next. We do have to get back to that, and this year has proved how urgent
that. Do you know that moment which I love in theatre more than almost anything else is when a play has finished and the final applause has gone down, and you turn to that person next to you whom you've had a fuss of banging elbows with and not been quite sure whether to have a conversation with them, and you catch their eye and you go, "Wasn't that wonderful?" And they go, "Oh." And then you make contact with others who've had the same experience with you in the theatre as you shuffle out. It's that catching the eye, that it's just, you cannot, as you say, you can't make up for that with Zoom.
No. So
anyway,
now
let's look at questions from others. That's what you want to do.
I've got a few questions, and interestingly, I'm going to start with one of the most recent to come in, which is what would you see as the next great story about, I think it says about this, but I think it means COVID, because it says, do you think, like the 1918 flu, this will be swept under the rug in 15 years? So it's true, isn't it, that there were very few stories told about the Spanish flu? And
yes, it is interesting. If you look at novels and things like that between the end of the First World War and the great period of the Great Gatsby and the 20s, and the youth and the roaring excitement of the jazz age, there is no literature that addresses the horror of millions dying in pain and loneliness, in huge, on treadle stretchers and in canvas emergency hospitals. It must have been a miserable time, and many of them, I mean, unlike COVID, the Spanish flu was particularly pernicious for the young, for healthy young men, precisely those who had managed to return from the trenches without injury, and they find the supreme irony of being knocked down by that. And I suspect, because I've spoken to agents and producers over the last few months, as you can imagine, we all have, and there's a kind of joke. They say, can you believe they send me a treatment for a kind of COVID drama? Who the hell wants to see that? There is this absolute assumption. The one thing we will not want to see for at least 10 years after this, once the vaccines have finally blown this away and we're all okay again, if we are, I think it's true. We won't want to see dramas about lockdown, seclusion, and COVID death. It may be the odd mention of it, but I doubt it'll feature much.
It might just feature as a sort of setup, mightn't it? Because theatre likes the pressure cooker play, the people who are trapped together in a room. So you could imagine it being the background for a play about people driving each other mad in a sort of look back in anger sort of way.
Yeah, absolutely.
But in a way, that's only the given circumstances, isn't it? Now,
it's true. Yeah.
Now, here we have people strangely interested in your career, Stephen. I don't know if it's out of concern and hoping. But actually, here's a really interesting question. Before we get on to, I've got some questions coming up about Holmes and Jeeves and things, which one might expect. But I was particularly interested because when you told your stories, I don't know if people always knew this, but when you told your stories in Mythos, both at the Shore and in Britain, you weren't going off an absolute script. You
No.
were you had your bullet points, and bits that worked tended to come back, as
Yeah.
we do when we tell our best stories. But it was a mix of the fixed and the flowing. And one of the questions I was struck by this evening is someone asking about the monk debate and your experience of that sort of debate, which is not the only one you've done, which is, as you know, a classic example of the fixed and the flowing, isn't it? You have your first speech pretty much word for word, but then a lot of the debate will hinge on how light you are on your feet and quick with your responses. So what's your key to that?
It's a really interesting point. I think there is, you can do debates where your main interest is the nature of a debate, and you go, okay, what side am I arguing? All right, I think I can think of some things to argue for that side of the debate. Or there is a debate where you're asked to take part, and it's something you really care about. You actually believe what it is that you are proposing or opposing. And then it becomes slightly more difficult. And that was the case with the monk debate, because I genuinely wanted to sort of make the point that I was worried that the culture wars were leading people into positions where they cared more about the purity of their view, how right they were, than with making the world a kind of happier, more at ease with itself kind of place. And so I thought, well, what I don't want to do is just score off the opponent, because it's my argument is not with people who believe in political correctness, because no one believes in political correctness. If you ask them, they say, no, I don't believe in political correctness, but I do believe this, which you may interpret as political correctness. So I didn't want to upset the, as it were, opponents. And also I was standing next to Jordan Peterson, who's a huge figure in at the time. He was, probably one of the most famous people in the world because of the huge success of the shows he did, and the fact that a large number of people flocked to his message of, that masculinity should be reclaimed and not be apologized for, and so on. And then we can argue about him. And of course, he's in an unhappy situation. Anyway, he's been very ill. But so I didn't want it to become a sort of jokey thing where I was on stage with someone I hated and wanted to just mock him, or that I wanted to mock the people I was against. I just wanted to calm it all down. And I think that's the key with debates, is actually most people you chat with, if you just take the heat and the anger out of the debate, people are very happy to talk to you. And that's kind of the point. I was rereading Freud recently, and he had this extraordinary idea, which I think is so beautiful and true, which he called the narcissism of small difference. And old Jordan Peterson came to fame because he refused to use the pronouns that trans people wanted him to use. And I didn't realize this at the time, but it was actually a debate about precisely that, the narcissism of small difference. Actually, if Jordan Peterson thought that it mattered that his freedom was utterly and irrevocably threatened by him being forced to call trans people by the pronoun they wanted to, then that was just his egotism. It was his absurd narcissism. Just give him a break and say, okay, I mean, you can say if you want to, I think it's a bit daft, but I'll call you that. All right. If it's going to offend you if I don't, it's no skin off my nose to do what you want to do. And similarly, trans people who are desperate to be called by the right pronoun, they don't need to be quite so upset if they aren't. It isn't a defense to their very existence and being unless they choose it to be. That on both sides, there is a kind of narcissism. There's you're with us or you're against us. And it isn't that. It genuinely isn't. Everybody can make an accommodation if they want to, and just say, all right, it isn't a question of my freedom or anarchy. It's just, I can just move this way and you can move this way. And it sounds very simple, but I do think that is behind most of the anger and upset behind public debate these days. And so the reason I say yes to things like the monk debate is not because I think I'll have a good time, because I know I'll get incredibly nervous and very worried about saying anything wrong, but because I genuinely believe that if I stand there and am reasonably friendly and encourage others to be reasonably friendly, then it should be apparent that this all or nothing, zero-sum game, with us or against us attitude is revealed to be as preposterous as I think it is, that actually we can all get on much better than we think we can.
Well, I have to say, you did a very nice job of that. I was there, and it was very clear in the room that the audience was sort of relieved every time you got up, because there was such a lot of noise coming from everyone else. And it showed also in your off-the-cuff remarks that you didn't take it as a kind of battle of wits where the task is to come up with the sharpest put down. You actually tended to take the question quite seriously, which is, I thought, very beautiful. All right, so now a few of the delving into the back catalogue things here. One of our audience is really enjoying your Sherlock Holmes narration.
Hurrah.
And wants to ask if you're enjoying doing it or have enjoyed doing it. I'm sure you've finished them now.
It was an extraordinary thing. For those who don't know, I did what Sherlockians call the canon, which is to say all the Sherlock Holmes stories written by Arthur Conan Doyle, because many have been written since Conan Doyle by kind of Conan Doyle wannabes or Conan Doyle's manqués, but there is the canon, which are the short stories and the novels of Conan Doyle, and I read them for Audible, and it's a lot. It's 72 hours or something, I think, and so it's a lot of reading. It's enough to make the larynx bleed, but I had enormous fun doing it. There is something about Conan Doyle's prose, this solid Victorian prose. It's like it's a bit like the Alan Bennett phrase, it's a thread of good class tweed running through English literature. That there is something so admirable and strong and crunchy about his sentences. He writes marvelously. He evokes fear and wickedness and everything else, sort of better than most thriller writers. So he's still just fun to read. And also the character of Holmes he just is ageless. And to be sitting even, you're in a studio and there's a big glass partition between you and the engineer, but nonetheless you are inside this world of fog and pipe smoke and certainty. I think that's what's so pleasing. We all and I don't want to go into some great gender horror here, but we all want a parent, a father in many cases, like Holmes. We want someone we can turn to who has the answers, who can suck on a pipe and frown a bit and just say this, and you go, oh, thank you. Because we live in an age where there are no adults anymore, Tim. There are no grown-ups. We hope that Joe Biden will be a grown-up, because obviously before America never had one for the past 4 years. But that there is no. It's the Wizard of Oz. There's no authority. They're just a fraud behind a curtain. There's no Dumbledore. There's no Sherlock Holmes. There's no master. There's no mistress. There's no one who can say, "Come, my children, this is the answer."
You're quite good at that sort of role, aren't you? I mean, a couple of people. No, I mean, because you are very imposing, and you have a beautiful, rich voice. All of this stating facts, as you know, I'm not in the business of blowing smoke up your fundament. You remember only too well how little I'm in that business. But you've played things like Jeeves.
Mm.
The Master of Hobbiton, was it? Or was it
Oh yes, Lake Town in The Hobbit. Yeah,
there you go, Master of Lake Town, and so on. You do this sort of avuncular authority rather well. Do you like playing those roles?
I guess I do. I mean, I can't deny it. It is pleasurable to play the teacher, the father figure, the mentor role is deeply enjoyable. When I was reading the Harry Potter books back in the 90s, the part I always enjoyed most was Dumbledore, just being that sort of figure. Partly because I grew up. I say grew up wanting it is not quite right. I didn't want it in the sense of lacking it. My father was a wonderful man, very fabulous and intelligent and all the rest of it. But I always sought out teachers and mentors. And I loved the idea of an authority, that there was someone who had a view of things and who had wisdom and a way of coping that I didn't have, and that they would pass it on to me. And so with doing roles like Jeeves or whatever, there is unquestionably a joy in being that character who can make everything all right again.
Mm. Very reassuring for us as well, of course, because once you know the structure of a Holmes or a Jeeves story, you don't really have too much anxiety. You just have well, we know that Jeeves will be the source of the redemption and the rescue. We just don't know how yet.
Yeah, exactly right.
And that one of our audience is you're going to have to help me here. Is interested to know what you think of Bridgerton. You mentioned Bridgerton in passing, and please tell us what you think about this very successful production. Is the question, which sounds a bit leading to me.
It is interesting, and it is leading to some extent, in as much as I'm a long time no longer secret, because I've come out about this, fanatic for the novels of Georgette Heyer, who single-handedly created Regency romance, really. I mean, well, actually, Jane Austen did. All romances, Regency or otherwise, owe everything to Pride and Prejudice. There is always, the plot is a bright, sparky, vivacious, intelligent female who meets a saturnine, dark, attractive, but slightly arrogant and dodgy male, and they hate each other at first sight, but we know they love each other. And then a parade of different men is laid in front of us. The stuffy, preposterous one, the rakish, dodgy one, the attractive but unreliable one, the respectable but dull one. All these different ones are laid before the heroine, and each one of them falls and is not acceptable, and then finally she's in the arms of the one we knew she should be. And that is the story of most romantic fiction, and it works very well, and we owe Jane Austen a great debt. But what's so wonderful about Georgette Heyer is that she's so witty and so historically profoundly well researched. The details that you get from Georgette Heyer's novels, and she wrote from the 1930s to the 1970s, the details of land management and parties and coaches and horses and costume and food, everything is stunningly well done. I mean, and the language, the joy of the language. And the point with Georgette Heyer is that you arrive in her books and you have to accept the world as she lays it out in front of you. It is an exact replica of the Regency period. And the Regency period is only 9 years. It's 1811 to 1820. And so the Act of Parliament of 1811, 1820, when George III died and the Prince Regent became George IV. In that time, a lot happened, notably 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, and the peace, as it was known. And so, it was obviously a very important time, but it's only 11 years, and yet there's a whole kind of literature attached to it. I'm taking a long time to come to Bridgerton, I grant you. But if you love Jane Austen, you love the fact that everybody who reads, sorry, not Jane Austen, if Georgette Hare, everybody who reads Georgette Hare feels, perhaps rightly, that they know more about the details of the Regency period than most cultural historians. That we are so, the detail of thieves' cant and servants and how much they're paid and how they work, and all these details are so beautifully done. But most importantly, the details in terms of gender, sex, expectation, marriage, love, all these, you have to accept how they were in Georgette Hare's day for her stories to make sense. So you become a Regency person with those values, which are often snobbish and appalling and dreadful, and we wouldn't accept them now. But if you dive into Georgette Hare, that's the reward. Now, with Bridgerton, what you're getting is a totally 21st century view of everything. And it's charming and buxom and rompy, but utterly and disastrously inaccurate in almost every degree. I mean, I love the way they say shall instead of will when expressing the future tense, and that's their idea of being early 19th century in their language. Shall you go to bed? Yes, I shall.
That's enough.
You've got to be slightly more accurate than that to reproduce the age. But they're doing something else, and it's wonderful what they're doing, and it's obviously hugely successful. So nothing I can say should or would take away from it. But it's not for me, because I love that period. I love the whole long 18th century, as historians call it, from the 1680s up to 1820. Which is, of course, nearly 140 years, but is what they call the long 18th century. It's a fascinating time of history, and Bridgerton is it's charming. But
very good. Yes, I'll cut you off there. So we're going to have to finish in a moment. I'm just going to sort of not summarize, but just tell you that I've been thinking, as you were speaking about Georgette Hare and Jane Austen and so on, that so much of what we've been talking about stories is to do with enjoying structure and enjoying ordering of things, and that in many ways it is only a question of the rules of the game, that once you've decided that the rules of the game in Georgette Hare are strict accuracy, then she mustn't break those rules. But as long as you come to something like Bridgerton saying, well, the rules of the game are that we don't care about that, but that we want everything to feel like it's Valley Girls, but in 18th century dress, then, but there are always certain rules of story shape, aren't there, about girl meets boy, girl loses boy, girl gets boy back again, or whatever it is, which once we've bought into them and decided that's the shape of story we like, then we really resist them being changed. As you know, children hate it when you change a story the third or fourth time you tell them. They want the same story.
Absolutely right. And it's funny you should mention children, because that's one of the things I would say about Greek myth that is different from us. It is, in Greek myth, the children can be killed. In Hollywood and our culture, they can't. If there's a young family and there's a monster on the loose, you know that the monster on the loose might kill the husband, might kill the wife, but the children, you can't see children on screen being killed. It is a taboo for us.
No, that's right.
Myth, Medea can chop up her own younger brother, who's a boy of 10 or 11, and throw his bits into the sea as a means of slowing her father down, because he'll have to stop and pick the bits of his own son. We would just not allow that. It doesn't, you could do terrible things with which the censor would pass, but we don't accept And the Greeks do go further. And in that sense, in order to enter the world of Greek myth, you have to give a bit of a shudder and understand that we're going back to meet ourselves at a time that we're not quite sort of ready to accept ourselves, perhaps.
That's good. Well, and as LP Hartley said, the past is another country. They do things differently there. So now we're out of time.
Well,
we're out of time. So the very last question, to which you can give a simple one-word answer, yes, or soon, is when are you coming back to the shore, Stephen?
Well, I hope to be invited. If I am, I will look at my diary and say, then I'm coming next April or whatever. But it would be lovely to come back, even just as a visitor, to go and see a season. And apart from anything else, thank you for looking in on Tim and me as we've chatted. And above all, thank you for keeping faith with the Shore Theatre and the festival, because it will be back, and it'll be back, and it'll be welcomed and better than ever before, because we now know how much we need things like that to be the first flowers to unfurl as the world gets back to normal. So I hope to witness that as much as an audience member, as a performer, but whatever role you'll see me in.
Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Fry.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks.